So in terms of part two of this lecture, it's useful to think a little bit about the global context within which we're operating. I think Usman's point raised that very, very well. So certainly, again, in lay language, the term globalization is often used to refer primarily to economic globalization, increasing economic trade ties and ties in terms of production of goods and cross-border movement of goods. I think it's important to conceptualize globalization much more broadly, which is not only about the movement of goods, but also the movement of people, of ideas, and of other types of resources across borders. Oftentimes what we hear about is increased interconnection. Of course, the fact that what happens in one country can very much affect what happens to people in another country, or the health or well-being of people in another country, but also to distinguish between interconnection and interdependence. And in the word mapping, I don't know if I saw interconnection, certainly I saw interdependence. And to distinguish between these two concepts, because interdependence we use to refer much more to the power, the capacity, and or the responsibility to respond. So you can imagine a situation where in one country they might be quite interconnected with what's happening next door, but they have there's not a lot of interdependence. They don't depend on the other country in order to manage that threat that's coming across the border. The notion of interdependence is that, in fact, increasingly, for even the most powerful countries or corporations or individuals, that in fact it's becoming more and more difficult to manage and respond to health threats across borders without collaborating in some way, working with some way across borders. And that's where this notion of interdependence really comes in. I think it's important to distinguish between these two. So let me not spend too much time on this. It's just the idea is really just to provide a number of examples of ways in which globalization has happened beyond the economic and financial realm. But move, in fact, to my next point, which is regarding not only that we're living in an era where we've had a globalization of context and threats, but also an era in which we have a globalization of opportunities and responses and ways in which to respond to the increase in cross-border threats. And finally, a globalization of governance. And if you remember that we were talking about health systems just a little while ago, this is how you might think about the social response. What is the response to some of these new threats that cross borders? And increasingly, we see that, in fact, governance has moved beyond the national level. So of course, you can see not only do we have a great diversity in terms of spending and resources, but also obviously a great diversity in terms of cultures and norms and values. Huge inequality, certainly, in health, and this is something that persists to this day, as well as the power, resources, and the capacities to respond. So a lot of interdependence here, but not necessarily evenly distributed interdependence. And of course, great complexity. And again, the importance of trying to develop some conceptual frameworks for us to begin analyzing the health of the global population is essential in terms of making sense of and wrestling with this global complexity. Major transitions, as Usman was saying earlier, in terms of particularly one of the most notable transitions, I would argue, in the global system overall is what has been called the rise of the rest, or the rise of the BRICS. I think everyone knows what BRICS stands for. Can anyone guess what MIST stands for? I'll give you a clue. The first country is Mexico, everyone's favorite country in this room.
Taiwan? Israel, Turkey, Indonesia? I would say Indonesia.
I think it's Indonesia, South Korea, Turkey. But really, it's kind of arbitrary, whether you're BRICS, MIST, middle-income country, emerging economies. It's a phenomenon that is still so relatively new, and the concept, I would say, is still so vague in a way, because the reality in a way is shifting very quickly. Nobody has really come up, in my opinion, with the perfect term for how do we in fact understand this major shift in the structure of the globe. And so this is, I think, the rise of the rest is the best that I've read about, but certainly major changes in what's happening worldwide. Major shifts in who has normative or discursive with information and interconnectedness across borders. Potentially the emergence of a transnational or global society. We'll get to this again in a few weeks. And finally, of course, the health and environmental transition, which we've already spent a little bit of time talking about. So if we think about what is the difference between the concept of a health system at national level, where we have under health conditions, as you just saw about an hour ago, the National Epidemiological profile, and the organized social response being the national health system, and what happens at the global level. What we would argue is that at the global level, you have much more of an emphasis on not the entire global epidemiological profile, but rather the global transfer of health risks. That in the absence of a global government, we don't have a global government that is responsible for, in fact, responding to every possible health condition in the globe. But what we do have is a global health system that should ideally be able to respond to the global transfer of health risks across borders. What we wanted to do is really just to spur your thinking on what are these global transfers of not only health threats, or cross-border transfers, I should say, of health threats, but also what types of opportunities does this raise? We're not only talking about global health as an arena of problems, but also very much an arena of solutions. So we have at least 6 categories of types of cross-border movement: elements of the natural environment, people with migration, production of goods and services. You remember the picture of the woman in China. Consumption of goods and services, ideas, knowledge, and culture, and rules. You remember the picture of the World Health Assembly. And you can see both in the reading as well as a number of the threats that you identified, as well as a number of potential health opportunities. And again, the notion here, the main point that we wanted to raise with this exercise is to think very expansively, or the value, I should say, of thinking expansively about what falls under this notion of global health, and what are the implications that may have for work on, for example, all of these different issue areas that are not necessarily the typical way in which the concept has been thought of before.